On a sweltering April night in 1957 in a cramped counting hall in Kerala, the air is so thick with sweat and cigarette smoke you can almost slice it with a knife. The clock on the wall crawls toward midnight. On a rough wooden table, piles of ballot papers grow, one stack taller than the rest, each slip of paper a whisper against the global order. Outside, thousands stand pressed against bamboo barricades. Some pray, some chant, some just stare, stunned by the idea that by sunrise the unthinkable might happen. At the center of the room, a thin man with sharp, thoughtful eyes adjusts his simple white mundu. No garlands, no bodyguards. Just a notebook in his hand and a storm in his head. AMS. Namboodiripad, EMS to friend and foe alike, watches the returning officers with the stillness of a man who knows that history is being tallied in front of him, bundle by bundle. On the blackboard, the numbers flicker in chalk. The Indian National Congress, the party that led the freedom struggle, the party of Nehru, is faltering. The Communist Party of India, led in Kerala by this quiet Brahmin from Malabar, inches towards something the world has never seen. A communist government elected through a fully free multi-party vote. In another corner of the hall, a rival watches him, a veteran Congress strongman in starched white khadi, eyes burning with disbelief. For years he mocked EMS as an armchair Marxist, a dreamer, a scribbler of articles. Tonight, every new tally eats into his certainty. He thought communists belonged in secret cells and prison barracks, not on the verge of taking power with ballots, not bullets. The world outside doesn't yet know it, but embassies in Delhi are already sending frantic cables. If the communists win in Kerala, where does it stop? Time is running out. In a few hours, the last constituencies will report. Either EMS will become the head of the world's first democratically elected communist ministry, or his enemies, in Delhi, in Kerala, even in Moscow, will dismiss him as a curiosity, a footnote. How does a boy born into one of the most rigid conservative Brahmin households in India end up in this room at this moment, on the brink of turning global politics upside down? To answer that, we have to step away from the smoke-filled counting hall and back nearly half a century into a world that feels almost medieval. The year is 1909. In the Malabar region of what is now Kerala, the British Raj is just a distant rumor. Real power lies in the ancient manas, the sprawling ancestral homes of the Namboodiri Brahmins and the great landlords. In Perinthal Mana, one such mana looms over fields of paddy shimmering in the sticky heat. This is Ilamkulam Mana, the house into which Ilamkulam Manakal Sankaran Namboodiripad is born. Inside its massive wooden doors, life is governed by ritual and rule, down to the smallest gesture. Oil lamps flicker before idols. Priests chant Vedic hymns in a language the village tenants, barefoot in the mud outside, cannot understand. The women of the household, the Antharjanams, live in near total seclusion, their worlds bounded by dark corridors and inner courtyards, and their faces hidden behind veils even from the sun. Outside, in the villages that feed this manor, another world grinds on, the world of the tenants and laborers. They work the land but do not own it. They bow to the landlord's agents. They remove their sandals, sometimes even their shirts, in the presence of caste superiors. Hunger is common. Dignity is rare. EMS is born into the very top of that pyramid. He is a Namboodiri, heir to a tradition that for centuries claimed spiritual and social supremacy. It should have been a birthright of comfort, unquestioned authority, respect. But from the beginning, the cracks show he is a sickly child, often confined indoors. While other boys play in the yard, he buries himself in palm leaf manuscripts and later in printed books. Every page opens a window beyond the high walls of Ilamkulam Mana. He learns Sanskrit as expected, but something unusual happens when he begins to encounter Malayalam and English literature. Stories of other lives, other worlds, other rules. In the dim light of the Mana's library, he stumbles onto works of social criticism, histories of revolutions elsewhere, the first timid stirrings of reformist writing in Kerala. Slowly, dangerously, he begins to see that the hierarchy surrounding him is not divine law. It is a human construction. But the system around him is relentless. At meals, tenants sit separately if they are allowed into the compound at all. A servant boy, barely older than EMS, waits to clear leftover food, eyes fixed on the floor. The young Namboodiri notices the boy's ribs through his thin shirt, but also notices something else, how no one else seems to notice. When he asks why some people must bow and some people may command, the answers are vague. Karma. Custom. It has always been so. Those answers do not satisfy him. Meanwhile, outside the feudal estates, Kerala is in ferment. New ideas seep in through mission schools and printing presses. The Nair community is undergoing social reform, the Ajavas challenge untouchability, and quietly some brave Nambudiras themselves begin to question the suffocating customs of their caste. As a teenager, EMS is drawn into that current almost by accident. A pamphlet here, a secret conversation there, a forbidden theater, performance that mocks Brahmin orthodoxy. The first real rupture comes when he encounters the Namboodiripad reform movement, particularly the bold plays and writings that ridicule the seclusion of women and the hypocrisy of upper caste men. This is his first shock, that the most brutal victims of the system he inhabits are not just the tenants outside but the women within. For someone of his birth, even attending a reform meeting is an act of rebellion. Family elders shake their heads, some are furious. But the world is changing faster than they can grasp. Newspapers, especially the newly founded Malayalam dailies, begin to carry debates on caste, land, and politics. EMS discovers another weapon he can wield from within the fortress: words. He leaves home to study, moving through institutions where, for the first time, he sits in classrooms with people who would once have been forced to stand outside the doorway. College life exposes him to currents far beyond Malabar. He reads about the Russian Revolution, about Marx and Lenin, about class struggle. At the same time, he is swept up in the stories of the Indian national movement, the drama of Gandhi's non-cooperation, the SALT, marches, the jailed satyagrahis. Two visions of change begin to grapple in his mind. On one side, Gandhi's moral, spiritual appeal, change through personal sacrifice, non-violence, the transformation of hearts. On the other, Marx's cold, unforgiving analysis of class and exploitation, which seems to describe with eerie precision the world. He grew up in landlords and tenants, priests and the landless poor. At first, he keeps a foot in both worlds. He is drawn to the Indian National Congress, the broad umbrella of the freedom struggle. In 1930s Kerala, Congress is more than a party. It is a moral claim. But even as he attends Congress meetings, listening to speeches about Swaraj and self-rule, he cannot ignore a question gnawing at him. Self-rule for whom? If power simply moves from British officials to native landlords and caste elites, what really changes for the tenant farmer whose children go to sleep hungry? This is where his rivalry with the mainstream truly begins, not as a personal feud, but as a collision of worldviews. In smoky meeting halls and cramped newspaper offices, EMS crosses paths with young leaders of the Kerala Congress establishment, articulate, ambitious men in crisp khadi, sons of lawyers and traders. They also despise British rule. They also go to jail for protests. But when tenants demand security of tenure or workers call for better wages, these leaders hesitate. First independence, then reforms, they argue. For EMS, that sequence feels like a trap. He has seen too much of what power does in the hands of unchallenged elites. His pen becomes his first battlefield. He writes articles that cut through the pieties of both caste and Congress. In fiery Malayalam prose, he dissects the feudal order of Kerala as a living museum of medieval oppression. He points out, with almost surgical coldness, how the landlords who lead the freedom movement preach sacrifice, but rarely sacrifice their own privileges. This is not just abstract theory. The words land like stones in a still pond. In drawing rooms in Malabar, his name drips from the lips of conservatives like an accusation. That boy from Alamkulam has lost his mind. In Congress circles, a subtler hostility grows. They respect his intellect. They fear his clarity. The man who will become his lifelong political rival, the symbol of the establishment he battles, begins to take shape in these years. Not one single face, but a composite. The orthodox landlord who dons nationalism like a new shawl, the Congress moderate who sees communists as dangerous dreamers, the administrator who believes order must be preserved even at the cost of justice. As the 1930s darken into the 1940s, the world convulses. Fascism rises in Europe. The Second World War erupts. The British drag India into the war without consultation. Gandhi calls for the Quit India movement. Congress leaders court mass arrest. The communists, however, take a different line, seeing the fight against fascism as paramount. In Kerala, where peasant unrest grows, this difference is not academic. It creates rifts that will define the rest of EMS's life. By now, he has moved decisively toward Marxism, the logic of class, the need for organized struggle, the vision of a society without exploitation. These answer the questions that haunted him since childhood. He becomes one of the key architects of the communist movement in Kerala, helping to build networks among workers, peasants, and intellectuals. But this choice carries a cost. To the British authorities, communists are subversives to be monitored, infiltrated, and crushed. Files begin to thicken in police stations with his name. Reports catalog secret meetings in Malabar, speeches in which landlords are named as oppressors, calls for strikes and boycotts. Under the Defense of India rules, bans are imposed, arrests ordered. The elegant halls of power where Congress leaders negotiate with the Raj are closed to him. Instead, he finds himself in bare prison cells and dim safe houses, passing coded messages by lamplight, knowing that at any moment, a knock on the door could end in years behind bars. Inside Congress, former comrades now look at him as a traitor to the national consensus. Oh, one of them, a rising star in the Kerala Pradesh Congress Committee, publicly attacks communists as enemies of the nation, importing foreign doctrines into India's sacred soil. Though he doesn't name EMS, everyone knows who is being targeted. The rivalry is no longer just ideological. It is institutional, it is personal, it is a race against time. The British Raj is weakening. Independence is on the horizon, though no one knows how near. For EMS, every passing year poses a stark question. Will the communists be strong enough, organized enough, rooted enough among the people to shape the India that emerges? Or will power simply fall into the hands of the very classes they've struggled against? He moves across Kerala like a man with an invisible stopwatch ticking in his head. Villages, towns, workers' lines near plantations, always speaking, writing, organizing. His background as a Namboodiripad gives him a strange, paradoxical advantage. When he attacks caste and landlordism, the blow lands harder. A pure Brahmin siding with the so-called low castes and the poor? It shocks. It forces people to listen. The British police respond as expected. Raids, surveillance, jail terms. And each time he is released, he returns to the same work, a little older, a little more certain that there is no turning back. In 1947, India finally becomes independent. The Union Jack comes down, the tricolor rises. Across the country, there is euphoria. Firecrackers, street processions, speeches of hope. For a moment, it feels as if the centuries have cracked open. But for EMS, the new dawn carries a cold shadow. In the princely states of Travancore and Cochin and in British Malabar, the structures he has fought against, landlordism, caste, privilege, bureaucratic arrogance, remain strikingly intact. The faces in office change from British to Indian, but the tenants' lives do not suddenly transform. Worse, in the new political order, his old rivals in the Congress now sit in government, with police forces and legal instruments at their disposal. Independence has come, but so has a new, more dangerous phase of his struggle. The communists, emboldened by their support among workers and peasants, push harder. Strikes spread, land struggles intensify. In Kerala's canals and coconut groves, the red flag begins to appear not as an imported symbol, but as a local banner of resistance. To the ruling Congress governments, state and central, this looks like an existential threat. India is barely born. The partition wounds are fresh. The Cold War is beginning to reshape global politics. A powerful communist movement in a sensitive border state is, to them, intolerable. In 1948, the hammer falls. The Communist Party of India is banned. Warrants are issued. Leaders are arrested or forced underground. Overnight, EMS goes from opposition politician and public intellectual to a hunted man. His rival, now part of the governing establishment, has at his command the full machinery of state repression he once protested under the British. But there is a twist. This time, EMS is not the young, uncertain rebel of his early days. He is one of the most experienced organizers in the country, with deep roots in Kerala's villages and towns. The ban does not break the party. It plunges it into a new, ruthless kind of test. He moves again through the landscape he knows so well: Malabar lanes, backwater ferry ghats, hidden rooms in sympathetic houses. But now every movement is calculated, every meeting a risk. There is a new, brutal urgency in the air. If they fail to reorganize under the ban, if they lose contact with village committees and trade unions, years of work will vanish. The ruling establishment has a timetable, too. They speak openly of wiping out the communists within months. The countdown is on. Somewhere in a district collector's office, his rival leans over a map dotted with pins, suspected hideouts, strong union branches, communist pockets. Raids are planned, leaders prioritized. The state believes it has the advantage of force, of law, of legitimacy. EMS has only conviction, networks, and the ticking awareness that if they do not survive this underground phase, they will never get another chance. Somewhere, impossibly far in the future, lies the image of that counting hall in 1957, the chalkboard, the ballots. But at this moment in 1948, it is anything but inevitable. He is a banned man in his own newly independent country, outpaced by his rival in the race for formal power, hunted by the police, of a government that calls itself democratic. The feudal boy from Mana, the skeptical student, the Congress rebel, the Marxist organizer, all of those earlier selves, converge into a single sharp point of decision. How do you build a future when every passing day could be your last as a free man? The answer he finds in those underground years, in hurried midnight meetings and whispered debates, will decide not just his own fate, but the fate of an entire state, and set the stage for the moment when, less than a decade later, the world will watch, stunned, as a man once forced to hide from the police walks calmly into office, elected by the very people whose suffering first tore open his sheltered world. On the night that India celebrates freedom with fireworks and speeches, somewhere in Kerala a lantern burns low in a mud-walled hut, and its light carefully blocked by a torn blanket. Outside in the darkness, a jeep rattles past on the dirt road, headlamps slicing the night like searchlights. Inside, a handful of men sit motionless, barely daring to breathe. One of them is the same thin Brahmin from Mana, his mundu now dust-stained, his hair a little grayer. AMS. Namboodiripad listens until the sound of the engine fades, then exhales slowly. The country is free. He is still a wanted man. This is the contrast that will haunt his life. Tricolors waving in Delhi, red flags hidden in village lanes, the great speeches of freedom echoing in Parliament, whispered plans in back rooms where a single informer could send everyone to jail. Independence for EMS arrives not as a triumphant march into the sunlight, but as a race against a new kind of darkness. The ban on the Communist Party has turned every day into borrowed time. He knows the police files on him grow thicker. He imagines his rival, that archetypal Congress leader, now wearing the crisp white of a minister, signing detention orders with the same hand that once held a protest banner against the British. The establishment he once challenged from the outside now holds the machinery of a sovereign state. The stopwatch in his head ticks louder. He has at best a few years. A few years to rebuild a shattered party, to anchor it so deeply in Kerala's soil that no ban, no baton charge, no court order can uproot it. Because he can feel it. If the communists lose momentum now, the new India will harden around them like concrete, locking in all the old injustices under a fresh coat of national pride. In the cramped rooms where underground committees meet, he maps out a strategy that is as audacious as it is simple. First, survive. Change names, change routes, change hideouts. Never sleep in the same place 2 nights in a row. Messages travel by trusted couriers, a biddy seller on a bicycle, a school teacher with a battered leather bag, all of them part of a network woven so tightly into ordinary life that it is almost invisible. Second, stay rooted. No amount of heroic sacrifice matters if the party becomes a ghost, a rumor. Cadres must keep visiting the huts of choir workers, the lines of plantation laborers, the fields of tenant farmers. Even if open meetings are impossible, even if leaders speak from behind the thin veil of darkness, the people must know that the red flag has not been lowered. Third, think beyond Kerala's fragmented map, because at this moment Kerala does not yet exist. The land that will become his battlefield is split 3 ways: Malabar under Madras presidency, Travancore and Cochin as princely, states now stumbling into democratic governance. Laws, languages of power, even police commands vary from district to district. It is not just the party that is divided. The very geography of political struggle is broken. This fractured landscape is his rival's greatest advantage. Congress governments can play one region against another, one community against another. Travancore's rulers can pretend Malabar's peasants are someone else's problem. Malabar's landlords can shrug at agitations in Cochin. For EMS, the clock is not just counting down to the next election, it is counting down to a more permanent settlement, the drawing of new state boundaries. If Kerala is carved out without the left entrenched in its villages and unions, Congress will inherit a neat, governable state where landlords and capitalists have had time to adjust, to disguise, to regroup. He cannot let that happen. In the early 1950s, as the ban is relaxed and the Communist Party once again peaks into legality, he emerges from the shadows thinner, perhaps but sharper than ever. The underground years have done something to him. They have burned away illusions. He no longer believes that good arguments alone can win. He has seen how quickly a government, even an Indian one, can turn to repression when its class interests are threatened. Yet he does not abandon the democratic path. In fact, he doubles down on it. When the first general elections are announced for 1951-52, the scale itself feels unreal. A country that is largely illiterate, held together by shaky railways and myths of ancient unity, is going to vote. The world scoffs. Even inside India, many predict farce. For EMS, the elections are not a curiosity. They are a deadline. He has barely 3 years from the ban's harshest phase to transform scattered clandestine cells into a force that can fight in the open arena of votes and campaigns. His rival in Congress has the resources of the state, the prestige of the freedom struggle, the blessing of Delhi. EMS has a still suspect organization and the unshakable conviction that if democracy means anything, it must mean the right of the poor to choose their own champions. The party debates are fierce. Some comrades still dream of insurrection, of short, sharp confrontations with the state. Others, influenced by Moscow, study the shifting line of peaceful transition. EMS argues with the calm intensity of a man for whom theory and the tenant's empty rice pot are part of the same equation. We fight where the people are, he insists. And right now, the people are going to the ballot box. The decision is made. The Communist Party of India will contest. What follows would in any other country be a minor miracle. In villages where the only written words most people recognize are temple notices and price lists, party workers teach them how to fold a ballot. In fishing hamlets by the light of kerosene lamps, EMS explains why Parliament in distant Delhi matters to the price of choir and the threat of eviction. In Malabar, he returns to the very estates where his own caste once ruled and speaks to men and women whose grandparents would have prostrated themselves before a Namboodiripad. The symbolism is electric. His Congress rival responds with a campaign polished by the best orators in the state. These communists, they warn from the stage, will bring violence, chaos, godlessness. They do not believe in our culture, our faith, our traditions. They point to the red flag and whisper of Moscow, of Stalin, of foreign hands pulling strings. EMS counters not with abstractions, but with questions. Has your landlord become kinder after independence? Has your wage risen? Have your children stopped going to bed hungry because the flag changed? The first results are mixed, and that in its own way is shocking. The communists do not sweep the polls, but they do not vanish either. They emerge as a formidable opposition in several regions, their vote share more than a mere protest. EMS himself enters the Lok Sabha, walking into the high-domed Parliament building not as a supplicant seeking favor, but as a tribune of those whose voices never echoed in such halls before. Inside Parliament, beneath the whir of ceiling fans and the droning of legal language, the old rivalry takes on a new intensity. On one side of the aisle sit the men who now rule India, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, urbane and visionary, flanked by Congress, veterans from every corner of the country. Among them, Kerala's Congress stalwarts beam with the satisfaction of power. They have the numbers, they have the backing of the global West in a world dividing into Cold War camps. On the other side sit a handful of communists, EMS among them, still watched by intelligence men, still whispered about as potential traitors. When he rises to speak, the House quiets. Some listen with curiosity, some with hostility. He speaks in polished English and forceful Hindi, but his arguments are rooted in the mud of Kerala's paddy fields. He challenges land policy, denounces police firing on peasants, warns that if democracy becomes merely a cover for the old elites, it will rot from within. His words are precise, almost surgical, but threaded with a moral anger that he never quite lets flare into rage. His Congress rival, now occasionally occupying a bench behind Nehru as a junior minister, watches with narrowed eyes. This was not how it was supposed to go. Communists were meant to be fringe agitators, not men who can hold the House with their logic, win headlines, and slowly shift the boundaries of acceptable debate. But EMS knows Parliament is only one front. The more decisive struggle is back home. While the national press obsesses over Nehru's foreign policy and the latest drama at the United Nations, something quieter but potentially more explosive brews in the South. The demand for linguistic reorganization of states. People want borders that match their tongues and cultures, not arbitrary lines drawn by British administrators or princely treaties. For Malayalis, divided between Malabar, Travancore, and Cochin, the dream is simple to say, hard to achieve. Aikya Kerala, a united Kerala. To Congress leaders in Delhi, the idea is negotiable, something to be examined by commissions and committees. To regional congressmen in Travancore and Cochin, it is a threat to their power bases. But to EMS, it is an extraordinary opportunity and a trap rolled into one. If a united Kerala is born under a Congress dominance, with landlords and big capital firmly in control, it could become a fortress of conservative power. But if the communists manage to root themselves as the authentic voice of Malayali aspirations, not just economic but cultural, then that new state could be the staging ground for something the world has never seen. Again, the clock starts. The States Reorganization Commission will not deliberate forever. Boundaries once drawn are not easily erased. EMS throws himself into the movement for Aikya Kerala with the same intensity he once gave to underground meetings. He writes pamphlets that link language and livelihood, culture and class. He argues that a genuine Kerala cannot be built on the backs of bonded labor and enslaved tenants. The twist is deliciously paradoxical. A committed internationalist Marxist becoming one of the sharpest champions of a regional linguistic identity. His critics call him opportunistic. He calls it strategy. For the first time, broad swathes of middle-class Malayalis, teachers, clerks, small shopkeepers, begin to see the red flag not merely as a symbol of class war, but as a banner under which their own sense of Keralite identity can gather. Congress scrambles to keep up. In public, they embrace the idea of linguistic states. In private, their Kerala leaders panic. The composite rival, now perhaps a chief minister in Travancore Cochin, now perhaps a powerful Pradesh Congress Committee chief, whispers in Delhi's corridors that giving too much ground to communists in Kerala will embolden them elsewhere. Nehru worries aloud about the communist problem in Kerala. Files circulate with alarming titles, subversive activities, red strongholds. C. American diplomats, sensing an opening in the global chessboard, argue that letting a communist party entrench itself in any Indian state is too high a risk. All of that, however, is still in the realm of memos and cables. On the ground, EMS moves as if he can almost hear each tick of history's second hand. By the mid-1950s, the map changes. The States Reorganization Act is passed. On November 1, 1956, the dream becomes reality. Kerala is born, carved out of Malabar, Travancore, and Cochin, a narrow strip of land between the Arabian Sea and the Western Ghats, lush with coconut palms and raging monsoon rivers, now exists. As a single political entity, the celebrations are wild. Processions weave through newly declared cities, banners proclaiming Aikya Kerala Zindabad. Loudspeakers crackle with patriotic songs. In the midst of it all, two currents run in opposite directions. One is hope that this new state, proud of its literacy, its cultural ferment, its history of social reform, will become a model for the rest of India. The other is fear that in this very state, with its long tradition of caste rebellion and peasant unrest, the communists, led by this soft-spoken Brahmin-turned-Marxist, might do what has never been done before, take power not by gun or decree, but by the cold, unromantic machinery of democratic election. Almost immediately, the race toward that possibility begins. Interim arrangements keep Congress in charge for the moment, but everyone knows the first full-fledged state elections are coming. The date is not yet fixed, but the window is narrow. Less than a year, perhaps, before the people of Kerala decide who will govern their newborn state. For EMS, this is the final, most unforgiving deadline. He tours Kerala like a man possessed. From Kasaragod in the north to Thiruvananthapuram in the south, he travels in rickety buses, third-class train compartments, sometimes perched on the back of jeeps. In fishing villages, he sits on choir bales with workers whose hands are cracked from salt and rope. In hill plantations, he listens to Tamil-speaking laborers who cut tea for a pittance. In dense, humid paddy fields, he wades knee-deep in mud to talk to tenants who still fear the landlord's writ more than the government's law. Everywhere he hears the same two stories, told in 1,000 different dialects, the pride of a new Kerala and the persistence of old wounds. Meanwhile, his rival and the Congress machine are far from idle. They too sense the stakes. If they lose Kerala, if a communist government comes to power anywhere in India, it will send a signal far beyond one state's borders. It might embolden peasants in Bengal, workers in Bombay, radicals in Hyderabad. It might make non-alignment look in Western eyes a little too red. Delhi pays attention. Behind closed doors, strategies are discussed. Could they postpone elections? Could they divide the opposition? Could they quietly encourage internal splits within the Communist Party? Could they use the fear of religious minorities, Christians in central Kerala, Muslims in Malabar, to paint the communists as a danger to their faiths? EMS reads all these possibilities like a man reading clouds for an oncoming storm. He knows his own party is not immune to division. Debates rage over tactics. Should they moderate their program to reassure the middle classes and minorities? Or should they promise sweeping land reforms and education policies that will electrify the poor but terrify the powerful? His answer is characteristically ruthless in its simplicity. We tell the truth. We promise what we intend to do. If we win without clarity, we will govern without a mandate. The manifesto that emerges is nothing short of explosive. It promises land reform that will strike at the feudal heart of Kerala's landlord system. It calls for the end of tenancy and security, for ceilings on landholdings, for redistribution. It commits to expanding education, to using the power of the state to lift the most oppressed castes and communities. It offers not vague upliftment, but specific laws, timelines, policies. Congress responds with its own promises, more cautious, more soothing. They warn that radical change will drive away investment, that Kerala's fragile economy will crumble under reckless experiments. From church pulpits and mosque courtyards, some religious leaders, uneasy about atheist Marxists, urge caution. Handbills circulate claiming that under communist rule, temples will be turned into grain depots, churches into party offices. EMS counters not with reassurance, but with an almost disarming candor. In one meeting after another, he insists that his fight is not against religion, but against the economic structures that keep believers in permanent subservience. He points out calmly that many of the fiercest struggles for justice in Kerala's past were led by priests, monks, and reformers of faith. The campaign gathers a momentum that surprises even seasoned observers. Meetings spill out onto streets. Village barbers debate politics while sharpening razors. Beady rollers pause to argue about land ceilings. In small, tiled-roof houses, for the first time, people find themselves weighing not who their landlord prefers, not who the local priest or party boss favors, but what kind of future they want for their children. His Congress rival feels the ground shifting. On stage, he is still commanding, still capable of stirring crowds with memories of the freedom struggle. But the faces in the crowd are younger now, less awed by jail stints under the British, more impatient with the stubbornness of hunger and debt. When he warns that communism will bring instability, some nod. Others ask quietly, is this stability we are living in now worth preserving? As Election Day approaches in the early months of 1957, the atmosphere in Kerala turns electric and tense. The state government arranges extra police deployments. Rumors of violence swirl. International journalists begin to trickle in, smelling a story that could upend Cold War narratives. Will India's democracy elect communists? American magazines commission nervous think pieces. Soviet commentators, more cautiously, watch to see if this strange Indian experiment will vindicate their theories or expose their limits. In the final days, every hour counts. EMS sleeps little, eats when he can. Doctors warn him about his health. He brushes them off. There is too much to do. In some constituencies, last-minute alliances must be negotiated. In others, rogue candidates threaten to split the anti-Congress vote. In one district, a key party worker is arrested on an old charge. EMS spends a night arguing with a hostile magistrate to get him released. His rival in cleaner offices and official bungalows plays a different endgame. He leans on district officials, urges them to maintain order, a phrase that can cover a multitude of pressures. He whispers to Delhi that a communist win will destabilize not just Kerala but the whole union. Some Some in the capital begin to talk in low tones of constitutional tools that could be deployed if things go too far. The polls open. From dawn they come, fishermen smelling of the sea, women with jasmine in their hair, workers in sweat-stained shirts, old men leaning on walking sticks. Many have never voted before. They stand in long, patient lines under the merciless sun, inked fingers held up with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. Inside the booth, symbols replace words. A pair of ears of corn, a hand, a sickle and hammer. Hands linger over the ballot paper. Some voters remember the landlord's warning. Others remember the policeman's lathi. Others remember a meeting where a quiet man in a white mundu spoke of land, school, dignity, not as distant dreams, but as policies with deadlines. For those hours, democracy in Kerala is not an abstraction. It is sweat, dust, paper, decision. And then comes the night in the counting hall, the night with which our story last left him. Cigarette smoke, chalk on the blackboard, bundles of ballot papers slapped down on tables already stained with ink and tension. Outside, the murmuring sea of citizens. Inside, EMS watching, his notebook open but his pen paused, as constituency after constituency reports results that, taken alone, might mean little, but together sketch a picture that makes his rival's face tighten like a drawn bowstring. The communists are not just winning seats. They are winning where, historically, power has never tilted toward the poor, in landlord strongholds, in mixed community belts, in coastal towns where religious divides used to be easy to exploit. Their allies, smaller left parties, independent radicals, are also doing well. As dawn threatens the eastern sky, one fact becomes impossible to deny. The Communist Party of India and its allies are on course to form the government of Kerala. In Delhi, telephones ring off the hook. Some argue that the governor should refuse to invite them to form a ministry. Others warn that such a move would tear the mask off India's democracy before the world. Nehru, wary yet committed to his country's constitutional image, hesitates. In the counting hall, EMS feels none of that distant drama. All he feels, for a brief stunned moment, is the weight of the journey from the inner courtyard of Alamkulam Mana to this crowded, noisy room. The faces of hidden women, of bent-back tenants, of beaten strikers flicker through his mind like frames of a film run too fast. Reporters push forward, notebooks ready. Cameras flash, a microphone is thrust toward him. How does it feel, someone asks breathlessly, to be the first communist leader in the world elected to power through a fully free vote? He answers with a half-smile that is more weary than triumphant. It feels, he says, like the beginning of a very difficult experiment, because he knows the rivalry has not ended. It has sharpened. His Congress opponent, temporarily defeated at the ballot box, still commands influence in Delhi, still has friends in the bureaucracy, in the police, in the business houses. Religious hierarchies regard the new ministry with suspicion. Foreign capitals watch with a mixture of alarm and curiosity. And somewhere in the thick file covers of the Home Ministry, contingency plans gather dust. For now. Days later, in the stately Raj Bhavan, under the cool gaze of oil portraits and chandeliers imported in another age, EMS stands to take the oath as Chief Minister of Kerala. The governor reads out the words slowly. I, Elamkulam Manakal Sankara Namboodiripad, do solemnly swear. As he repeats them, each syllable lands with the weight of unspoken questions. How far can a communist government go within a capitalist federal democratic republic? How long will Delhi tolerate radical land reforms, people's education, police reforms? How quickly will his enemies regroup? And perhaps most dangerously, can a party forged in underground struggle adapt to governing without losing its soul? Outside the walls of Raj Bhavan, thousands wait, craning for a glimpse of the man they have elevated from fugitive to first minister. In one of the crowd stands a tenant farmer who once watched his father bow before a landlord from Elamkulam caste. Today he wipes sweat from his brow and whispers to his son, "That man up there, he is one of them, but he is also one of us." The stopwatch has not stopped. It has merely been reset. Now every day in office will be measured not in speeches, but in laws passed or blocked, in police orders obeyed or defied, in battles, won or lost in court and on the streets. The countdown has begun again, this time to find out whether the world's first democratically elected communist government can survive long enough to change anything at all before the forces aligned against it decide that this experiment has gone far enough. The ink on the oath is barely dry when the first police report lands on his desk. Outside the secretariat in Thiruvananthapuram, where red flags still flutter from the victory rallies, a group of dismissed estate workers are sitting on the hot pavement, refusing to move. The same policemen who only weeks ago watched them celebrate a communist win are now gripping Lothis, waiting for orders. The first real test of power comes not in the form of a grand policy, but in a simple, brutal question. When the crowd refuses to disperse, does the new Chief Minister of Kerala tell the police to charge? For a heartbeat, the irony is vicious. AMS. Namboodiripad, who has tasted jail, who has run from batons in the night, now carries the authority to unleash them. He stares at the report, the words swimming. Demonstration obstructing traffic, possibility of disturbance, request permission for firm action. Behind those bureaucratic phrases, he hears other echoes. Nehru in Delhi watching from afar, newspapers eager to pounce, his old Congress rival waiting for proof that communists in power are no different from anyone else, or worse, that they are hypocrites. He takes a breath and does something that will set the tone for his government. He asks for time, not to evade, but to think. Because for EMS, power is not a costume to be worn. It is a problem to be solved every single day. He calls in the Home Secretary, the police chief, a couple of trusted comrades. He asks questions, details, insists on alternatives. Can the workers' demands be heard quickly? Can traffic be diverted? Can negotiations start at once? When a visibly uncomfortable police officer mutters about loss of discipline, EMS fixes him with the calm, unblinking gaze that once silenced landlords in Malabar. Discipline, he says quietly, is not measured only by how hard you hit. It is measured by how precisely you avoid hitting unless there is no other way. The order that finally goes out is clear. No lathi charge, no firing. Send a labor officer, start talks. Use force only if there is imminent danger to life. It is a tiny decision in the ocean of governance. Yet it is also a declaration. This government will try, desperately, imperfectly, to behave differently, but time is not on his side. From the moment he takes office, a clock begins to tick in places far from Thiruvananthapuram. In the file rooms of the Home Ministry in Delhi, under headings like Kerala Situation, officers assemble weekly reports. In the air-conditioned offices of foreign embassies, analysts type memos with headlines such as First Communist Ministry in a non-communist country, and somewhere in a whitewashed bungalow not far from Kerala's Secretariat, his Congress rival sits at a polished teak desk, a calendar. On the wall behind him, each day marked as another step toward what he calls, bitterly, the correction of an aberration. The aberration is simple. For the first time, the poor in a corner of the capitalist world have used the ballot to choose a party that openly speaks of class struggle. EMS knows that for this very reason, he and his comrades cannot simply occupy the chairs and enjoy the curtains. They have to deliver, fast. The manifesto that electrified the villages now sits before him in the form of draft bills, committee notes, and legal opinions. Every promise has to run a gauntlet of constitutional constraints, property rights, coalition pressures, and administrative inertia. Two fronts emerge almost immediately, blazing hot and unforgiving. The first is land. For generations, Kerala's countryside has run on a feudal logic cloaked in ritual. Tenants till fields they do not own, paying rent in grain or cash, living under the constant threat of eviction. In some places, old customs still grant landlords the right to enter a tenant's home at will. The Communist Party came to power on the back of these people's rage and hope. Now they want results. EMS knows that if he fails here, everything else will be dismissed as decoration. So the government's draft of the Kerala Agrarian Relations Bill is bold, almost shocking in its ambition. It sets ceilings on how much land one individual can own. It offers security of tenure to tenants. It envisions redistribution of surplus land. When the draft circulates, the reactions are immediate and ferocious. In the grand verandas of Nair Tharavads and Christian planter bungalows, conversations curdle into panic. They will take our land. They will destroy centuries of tradition. In clubhouses where ceiling fans stirred gin-scented air, men who never attended a peasant meeting now leaf through the bill with trembling fingers. His Congress rival finds his opportunity. He cannot openly declare, "I stand with the landlords," not in a state whose very birth was accompanied by dreams of social reform, so he frames his resistance as moderation. Reform, he tells gatherings of middle-class professionals, is necessary, but this bill is rash, confiscatory, destabilizing. Investment will flee, chaos will follow. Behind closed doors, however, he comforts the powerful with a different promise. This will not be allowed to pass in its present form. Delhi is watching. The president has powers. The courts will not permit this level of extremism. At the same time, another storm brews on the second front, education. Kerala's literacy, pride of Malayalis, rests largely on a network of schools run by private managements, many under church control, some held by community organizations like the Nair Service Society. Teachers in these aided schools are paid with government funds, but principals hire and fire at will. Political loyalty and community affiliation often matter more than merit. For a communist government that dreams of an egalitarian society, this arrangement is intolerable. They prepare an education bill that seeks to regulate appointments, curb arbitrary dismissals, and bring these schools under stricter public oversight. On paper, it looks like a step toward fairness. In pulpits and parish halls, it is painted as an attack on faith. Sunday sermons thunder with warnings. They want to control your children's minds, i.e., pamphlets display a school building with a cross on top, its doors being padlocked by a sinister hand holding a hammer and sickle. Nuns who have spent their lives teaching in village classrooms are told that the government will humiliate and sideline them. The narrative is brutally effective. In central Kerala, where Syrian Christian communities are strong, fear and anger begin to churn. The Congress rival, sensing a chance to turn class anxiety into religious outrage, moves swiftly. He meets church leaders, expresses concern, offers to champion their cause. Photographs of him emerging from bishops' houses, head slightly bowed in respect, appear in newspapers. Soon EMS finds himself fighting two wars at once, one against feudal land relations, another against a carefully stoked fear that the state will trample religious freedom. And above these wars hovers the most dangerous question of all: how far will Delhi let him go? In his more reflective moments, EMS describes his government as walking a tightrope strung between two abysses. On one side, betrayal. If they dilute reforms too much, they lose the trust of the masses who lifted them to power. On the other side, isolation. If they push too hard, too fast, they give their enemies the excuse they are waiting for. The legislature debates on the Agrarian Relations Bill and the Education Bill become theaters where this balancing act plays out in public. In the Assembly, EMS is at his finest. He unrolls statistics like weapons, cites peasant testimonies, invokes the Constitution's promise of justice. His thin frame leans toward the microphone. His voice, never booming, somehow fills the chamber. He reminds the House that democracy is not merely the counting of heads, but the transformation of lives. Across the aisle, his Congress rival replies with a different tone, hurt patriotism tinged with warning. "We fought for independence together," he says, fist on the table. "We built this Constitution to protect all communities. Do you think you alone care for the poor? We also want reform, but not revolution through the back door." Outside, the fight spills onto the streets. In one village, a landlord wakes at dawn to find a red cloth tied to his gatepost, a silent signal that his tenants have joined the union. In another, a Christian school's playground fills with students holding placards, "Hands off our schools." In a small town, an effigy of EMS is paraded, garlanded with shoes, then burned. And on the very same afternoon, in the same town, choir workers carry his portrait on their shoulders like an icon. Newspapers feast on the clashes. One day's headlines scream, "Communist police lately charge peaceful protesters." The next day's landlord goons attack tenants. In reality, the picture is far messier. A few overzealous local party leaders, some provocateurs planted by enemies, police officers still loyal to old bosses. Each instance, however small, is entered into a ledger in Delhi. Weeks become months. The bills inch forward through committees, amendments, court challenges. EMS spends long evenings with legal experts, arguing over commas that could mean the difference between constitutional and unconstitutional. At night, in his official residence, he reads reports of peasant suicides, teacher strikes, minor communal flare-ups, all compressed into sterile language that cannot mute their urgency. The time pressure is relentless. He knows that in less than 5 years, at most, Kerala will vote again. He also knows that he may not even have that long. Articles of the Constitution, especially the notorious Article 356, allowing the center to dismiss a state government in cases of breakdown of constitutional machinery, hover over every decision like a shadowed bird. Then comes the twist he has half expected, half dreaded. The opposition finds a name for its crusade. They call it the Vimochana Samaram, the liberation struggle. It is a masterpiece of political branding. Liberation is a word the left has often claimed, but now it is turned against them. Congress leaders, church hierarchies, sections of the Nair Service Society, Muslim League figures, unlikely allies, some of whom once eyed each other with suspicion, begin to march under a shared banner, liberation from the communist government. The protests swell. In town after town, processions wind through the streets. Priests in cassocks walk beside lawyers in black coats, students beside landlords. Black flags flutter, slogans rise, down with dictatorship. Save democracy, save religion. Women carry images of saints and gods. Men carry placards accusing the government of totalitarianism. At first, EMS hopes the agitation will spend its energy and fizzle. He underestimates the depth of the campaign and the foreign interest in it. Later, declassified documents and memoirs will hint at the invisible hands that may have encouraged the movement. American diplomats, reporting nervously about Red Kerala, funds flowing toward friendly organizations, strategic advice whispered about how to make a democratic government look undemocratic. For now, what EMS sees are the visible results, a movement growing more daring by the week. Demonstrations target government offices, block roads, try to shut down normal life. Stones fly, police respond with tear gas. In one chilling incident, a student dies in the chaos of a protest gone out of control. Photographs of his body, shirt stained dark, are printed and reprinted, held aloft in rallies as proof of communist brutality. His Congress rival stands on a stage, microphone trembling slightly in his hand, and declares in tones of sorrowful righteousness, "We did not shed blood to fight the British, just to bow before a new tyranny." He carefully avoids calling for violent overthrow, but his speech is laced with phrases that nudge, that suggest, that ignite. Delhi wavers and watches the clock. The longer the struggle continues, the more the central government hears one refrain. Law and order is collapsing in Kerala. Governors send alarmed reports. Editorials sound dire warnings. International press columns ask whether India will tolerate a Soviet beachhead on the Arabian Sea. In private, Nehru is torn. He respects the verdict of elections, fears the precedent of dismissing a government for its ideology, but he also fears Kerala spiraling into chaos, fears a backlash that could strengthen the right across India, fears, perhaps most of all, the perception that he is soft on communism. EMS senses the center edging closer to the precipice. He tries everything within the law to pull the state back. He offers compromises on the education bill without surrendering its core. He signals willingness to phase in land reforms to smooth their impact. He meets religious leaders personally, sitting cross-legged on their polished floors, listening to grievances, clarifying intentions. He reins in overzealous local cadres, even expelling some. Inside his own party, tensions sharpen. Younger, more impatient comrades grumble that the government is retreating, that the old underground fire is being doused by the cold water of constitutional caution. Others, especially those with experience of the jails and the police, warn that pushing the center too far could end the experiment for decades. The internal debates foreshadow a greater rupture to come, the split in the Communist Party of India itself, just a few years away. Between those more aligned with Moscow's cautious line and those more sympathetic to Beijing's confrontational stance. For now, however, the comrades in Kerala are united by a common immediate threat. The liberation struggle reaches its crescendo in 1959. In Thiruvananthapuram, the roads to the Secretariat are clogged with protesters. Some have legitimate grievances, others are swept along by fear, rumor, or sheer excitement. Slogans drum the air. Stones clatter on the tiled roofs of government buildings. Police lines buckle, reshuffle, hold. Inside his office, EMS receives a call from Delhi. The voice on the other end is polite, almost weary. Discussions have been held, the cabinet has deliberated, the president has been advised. The phrase comes, couched in legal language but utterly clear. Breakdown of constitutional machinery. The decision is made. The communist government in Kerala will be dismissed. President's rule will be imposed. For a moment, EMS says nothing. He looks out at the city from his window, at the palm fronds shaking in the monsoon wind, at the distant shimmer of the sea. Somewhere in that restless expanse, men and women he has fought for are unaware that their choice at the ballot box has just been overruled by a pen stroke in Delhi. His Congress rival, hearing the news in another building, feels a fierce, guilty relief. Publicly, he will express sorrow that matters have come to this. Privately, he will tell himself that he has saved the state. Perhaps sitting alone that night, he too will hear the faint, uncomfortable whisper of a question. If democracy can be corrected whenever it produces an inconvenient result, what exactly has been liberated? The next day, EMS walks down the steps of the Secretariat, no longer as chief minister but as a dismissed leader. The red flags that greeted his arrival 2 years earlier are fewer now, some torn, some carried more in defiance than celebration. His supporters line the path, anger and disbelief written across their faces. Some eyes are wet, a few shout slogans. Others stand in stunned silence, as if the ground they stood on has shifted under their bare feet. He raises his hand not in triumph, not in surrender, but in a gesture of reassurance. His voice when he speaks carries not the thunder of a rally, but the steadiness of a man who has already decided what this defeat will mean. This is not the end, he tells them. This is the proof of what we said all along, that the struggle for people's power does not stop with elections, and it does not stop with dismissal. We will go to the people again. We will organize again. We will fight again, inside the system and, when necessary, outside it. The stopwatch in his mind resets once more. Expelled from office, he plunges into work with the intensity of a man racing not just against his rivals, but against history's tendency to turn experiments into footnotes. He travels across India, explaining what happened in Kerala, warning that Article 356 can become a weapon against any state that dares to depart from the center's comfort zone. Within the Communist Party, battles over strategy, ideology, and international alignment sharpen into open conflict. The split of 1964 rips through old friendships. EMS chooses the path that will become the Communist Party of India, Marxist, aligning himself with those who argue for a more independent Indian Marxist line. Skeptical of both Moscow's compromises and Beijing's adventures, many predict that the dismissal and the split will weaken him irreparably. The twist is that they do something stranger. They harden him. By the mid-1960s, as coalitions begin to replace single-party dominance in state after state, EMS sees a new opening in the very fragmentation that others lament. In 1967, a coalition of 7 parties, socialists, communists, regional outfits, comes together in Kerala, united less by love than by a shared determination to keep Congress out. They need a leader who can speak to workers without scaring small traders, who can negotiate with Muslim League elders in the morning and address radical student unions in the afternoon, who can carry the scars of dismissal without radiating bitterness. They turn again to the thin Brahmin from Elamkulam. EMS becomes chief minister once more. This time the context is different. He heads not a single-party communist cabinet, but a fragile mosaic of allies. Yet the goals remain hauntingly similar: land reform, educational expansion, decentralization of power to local bodies, strengthening of public distribution. He moves quickly to push forward what the first ministry began, particularly on land. If the first government's Agrarian Relations Bill was the opening salvo, the second provides much of the political groundwork for what will become, shortly after his term, the landmark Kerala Land Reforms Act, the law that more than any other will finally break the back of feudal landholding in the state. Sealing provisions tighten, tenants gain unprecedented security. In village after village, documents change hands, often in tense, emotional ceremonies. Land that families have worked for generations, but never owned, now becomes legally theirs. For some, the piece of paper is the first official acknowledgement that they exist as citizens with rights, not as shadows under another man's title. At the same time, EMS pushes an idea that will, years later, become a cornerstone of Kerala's political culture: genuine local self-government. He speaks of shifting planning from airless rooms in the capital to open meetings in panchayat courtyards, where farmers and fisherfolk can voice priorities directly. Committees sprout in wards and villages, discussing everything from irrigation to school roofs, a foreshadowing of the people's planning process that, long after he leaves office for the last time, will make Kerala a global reference point for participatory democracy. His Congress rival watches this comeback with a mixture of exasperation and grudging respect. He had hoped that dismissal would finish EMS, that the radicals would eat him alive, that the people would tire of agitation. Instead, they have brought him back, this time at the head of an even broader front. The rivalry takes on an almost mythic tone in Kerala's political life. Two visions of what democracy should be, locked in a contest that jumps from ballot boxes to courtrooms to village squares. Yet even this second tenure is not destined to last a full term. Coalition stresses, ideological tensions, external pressures all gnaw at the government. In 1969, EMS does something that, in the ruthless arithmetic of power, seems almost absurd. He resigns voluntarily to allow a reconfigured coalition under a different communist leader to stabilize and carry forward the program. Power for him has never been the end. It has always been a means. He steps down, not into retirement, but into a new role as strategist, writer, organizer, thinker, a man who has twice led Kerala and twice walked away, once pushed, once by choice, leaving behind a state that is no longer the feudal land he first agitated in, but also not yet the social laboratory the world will admire. Outside India, commentators still argue about the Kerala experiment. Was it a failure, proven by dismissal and instability? Was it a success, visible in rising literacy, declining landlord power, the assertiveness of lower castes and classes? Inside Kerala, the answers are written less in essays than in lived realities. In the fact that a tenant calls his field my land, that a girl from a fishing village reads newspapers, that a village council argues openly with state officials. In all of this, in every plot of redistributed land, every village meeting, every heated assembly debate, the imprint of EMS is unmistakable. A man who tried to stretch the grammar of parliamentary democracy until it could accommodate, however imperfectly, the urgent poetry of social revolution. The clock that has chased him from underground days to chief ministerial office and back again has not stopped yet. It has simply changed what it measures. Now it is counting not the years left for a single experiment in one state, but the decades in which the ideas he has planted about land, about education, about people's power, will either take root across India or wither under the weight of compromise and backlash. He knows more clearly than ever that he will not live to see the final answer. But he also knows this. For the boy who once walked barefoot through the courtyards of Alamkulam Mana, forbidden to see the faces of the women in the inner rooms, the journey from that cloistered world to the open, contentious, cacophonous space of Kerala's political life has already torn down more walls than he was ever told existed. In a narrow upstairs room in Thiruvananthapuram, decades after those first red flags were raised and torn down, an old man sits at a small wooden table that looks too fragile to hold the weight of his papers. Outside, neon signs flicker with the promises of a new India. Consumer loans, color televisions, instant noodles. Inside, under a feeble tube light, EMS. Namboodiripad is writing an editorial that begins with a sentence no one expects from a lifelong communist. Socialism, he writes, has suffered a historic defeat, but the need for socialism has never been greater. His hands tremble slightly, not from doubt, but from age. He glances at the wall clock. It is just past dawn. The editor of the party daily is waiting. Printers will not hold the presses for memories, however glorious. He has, he often jokes darkly, two deadlines now. The one at the newspaper and the one in his chest. The second one is catching up. After he steps down as chief minister for the second time in 1969, many assume EMS will gradually fade into the background, a historic figure wheeled out for anniversaries. His speech is quoted but no longer feared. Instead, he does something typically perverse. He leaves the glare of the chief minister's office and walks into a role that is stricter, lonelier, and in many ways more demanding. He becomes, almost full-time, the mind of a movement. From the mid-1960s into the late 1970s, as the newly formed Communist Party of India, Marxist, struggles to define itself against both the Congress and its parent, the CPI, EMS serves as its first general secretary. The job description is simple and brutal. hold together a party spread across thousands of kilometers, with factions, egos, ideological disputes, and a central government that would be delighted to crush it. He shuttles between Kerala, West Bengal, Andhra Pradesh, Delhi. Sleeper-class train compartments become his moving office. He reads party reports under dim bulbs, argues over draft resolutions in cramped rest houses, naps for an hour, then wakes to address public meetings in towns whose names he sometimes only learns from the station signboards. His old Congress rival, now a seasoned national leader himself, watches this transformation with a mix of calculation and unease. The rivalry, once rooted in local land reform battles and assembly floor clashes, has expanded. The stage is now all India. Coalitions rise and fall in Delhi. Regional parties demand their share. The Congress's once iron grip begins to loosen. In this fluid landscape, EMS's party, dismissed as too doctrinaire by some, as dangerously subversive by others, must decide how close to stand to power without being swallowed by it. Then, in 1975, the lights go out. Indira Gandhi declares the emergency. Fundamental rights are suspended. Opposition leaders are arrested in midnight swoops. Newspapers carry blank spaces where articles should have been. A visual scream that censorship has taken hold. In those suffocating months, EMS's old underground instincts flare to life. He has seen this movie before, under a different flag. The CPI, which has chosen a line of cooperation with Indira Gandhi, calls the emergency a necessary step. The CPI-M takes the opposite path. Its leaders go underground or to jail. In Kerala, party workers vanish into safe houses in fishing villages and hill hamlets. Cyclo-styled pamphlets appear mysteriously on tea-shop tables at dawn denouncing authoritarianism. EMS, frail in body but fierce in purpose, spends those years as both strategist and symbol. The government knows he is no ordinary opponent. They watch his movements, intercept his messages, consider the optics of arresting a man whose name is already woven into Kerala's political history. He is no romantic about the moment. He does not see it as a glorious revolution. He sees it as a dangerous test. Can his party oppose a creeping dictatorship without accidentally helping the very right-wing forces that wait in the shadows for any chance to destroy both Congress and the left? Time pressure is everywhere. Every day of emergency that passes normalizes the abnormal. The longer people live with fear, the more they fold it into their routines. If resistance cannot keep up, if the underground networks falter, if the stories of arrests and torture are not told, then a new common sense will set in that rights are privileges to be withdrawn at will. EMS throws himself into the exhausting work of keeping that from happening. He writes clandestine analyses that move hand-to-hand like contraband. He constructs arguments that will, once the emergency ends, help the party explain why civil liberties are not a luxury of the middle class, but the oxygen without which workers' struggles cannot breathe. When the emergency finally lifts in 1977 and the electorate delivers Indira Gandhi a stunning defeat, the country exhales. In Kerala, as elsewhere, people spill into the streets, not just to celebrate the new government in Delhi, but to test the air of freedom like someone stepping out after a long confinement. It could have been the perfect moment for revenge. EMS does not take it. When his Congress rival, battered by his own party's internal storms, appears at a public event in Kerala and is met with jeers, EMS does something unexpected. He raises his hand and quiets the crowd. "We oppose the emergency," he says, pointing at his rival. "Not to replace one intolerance with another. We will fight his policies, yes, but we will also defend his right to speak as we defend our own." It is a small scene, barely noted in the next day's papers, but it marks a turning point in their decades-long duel. The war between them will be fought with all the ferocity of conviction, but within lines that both men, in their own ways, now see as vital. While Delhi cycles through coalitions and crises, Kerala continues its own strange experiment. By the 1980s, the outlines of something the world will later call the Kerala model begin to emerge. The state is still not rich, far from it. Unemployment is high. Many young men board planes to the Gulf, returning with suitcases and stories of desert cities. But life expectancy rises, infant mortality drops, literacy nears universality, village health centers function, women's movements grow louder. In each of these statistics, EMS sees not just numbers but an argument. He frames it again and again in speeches and essays. You do not have to wait to become rich before investing in people. Rights, education, healthcare, they are not rewards of development. They are tools that make development possible. His rival counters from the opposite flank. In business forums and party conventions, the Congress leader warns that Kerala is becoming a state of consumers without producers, of militants without investors. He points at shuttered factories, at capital fleeing to other states where unions are weaker. You cannot eat literacy, he sneers in one memorable television debate. You have to produce something first. The cameras catch EMS's face as that line lands. He does not flinch. Ask a mother, he replies calmly, whose child did not die of fever because there was a nurse in the village clinic, whether she can eat literacy. She will tell you she eats it every day in the life of that child. The clash is not just of policies, it is of imaginations. For EMS, the stakes have never been higher. He is into his 70s now. Diabetes gnaws at his strength. He knows he will not be chief minister again. The party has younger leaders, new faces that must carry the banner into unfamiliar terrain. Global winds are shifting. The Chinese Cultural Revolution has left disillusion in its wake. Movements in Africa and Latin America face brutal pushback. The idea of socialism itself is under siege. He gives himself a rough timetable. 10 years, he tells a close comrade once, during a late-night walk in the party compound, mosquitoes whining at their ears. 10 years. In that time, we must do two things: deepen what we began in Kerala and build a theory that learns from our mistakes. After that, history will not ask my opinion. It will deliver its verdict. Those 10 years coincide with one of the boldest experiments of his political life, and it happens when he is no longer in formal power. In 1996, a left Democratic front returns to office in Kerala. EMS, by now a grand old man more at home in a library than in a motorcade, becomes the chief architect of something radical, the People's Planning Campaign. The idea is disarmingly simple and quietly subversive. Take nearly a third of the state's development budget and push it down, not just to the district, not just to the block, but to the panchayat, the village council. Ask ordinary people to decide in open meetings how to spend it. Force bureaucrats and engineers to listen to farmers and fisherfolk and nurses describing what they need. It is democracy with its sleeves rolled up. But it is also a race. The campaign is tied to the 9th five-year plan, a fixed block of time. If in those 5 years the experiment degenerates into chaos, if money is siphoned off by local elites, if projects remain on paper, if village meetings turn into shouting matches without results, enemies will have their proof. They will sneer. This is what happens when you give the masses control. Confusion, waste, irresponsibility. EMS, formerly the vice chairman of the State Planning Board, in reality its moral engine, throws himself into the work as if he has never held higher office. He travels relentlessly, addressing gram sabas in schoolyards where buffaloes graze nearby, in church courtyards where women in bright saris sit with notebooks in their laps. He lectures administrators, writes thick position papers, answers petty complaints with the same seriousness as constitutional queries. His Congress rival, now retired from active politics but still sharp-tongued, watches warily. In private conversations, he scoffs that the campaign is a big tamasha, a spectacle. In 5 years, he tells a gathering of old Congress hands, this will all collapse under the weight of its own promises. Then people will remember who can actually run a state. But something else happens. In village after village, for the first time, people who have spent lives being spoken for now speak. A Dalit woman stands up in a gram sabha and demands that the village budget set aside money for toilets so her daughters will not have to walk into fields before dawn. A fisherman, toes digging into the sand, angrily asks why his community school still leaks while new roads are neatly laid to tourist resorts. A group of young men propose a small-scale computer center, laughed at first but later quietly approved. Budgets that would once have been drawn up in secretariat conference rooms, with neat columns and almost no public scrutiny, are now scribbled on blackboards in chalk for all to see. Revisions are debated under oil lamps. The process is messy, imperfect, riven with local power struggles, but it is alive. EMS, moving from one dusty panchayat hall to another, feels something he has not allowed himself in years, a dangerous, untheoretical burst of hope. He imagines just for a moment what it would look like if this spirit were replicated across India, if tribal villages in central India, bastis in Delhi, slums in Mumbai had similar power over their own development funds. He knows it is unlikely in his lifetime. But the very possibility is like a jolt of electricity through tired limbs. Then, as if history were jealous of these small victories, the world shifts under his feet. In 1991, the Soviet Union, which once seemed like the granite proof of history moving in one direction, collapses with a speed that stuns even its enemies. Statues fall, red flags are lowered, burned, folded away. Television screens fill with images of people smashing the symbols of a system EMS once defended as the vanguard of human progress. In India, at nearly the same moment, a balance of payments crisis pushes the country into economic liberalization. Tariffs are cut. Public sector units are whispered about as sick and burdens. The language of policy changes. Socialism is quietly retired. Reform now means privatization, disinvestment, FDI, market. Friendly reforms become the new mantras. For his Congress rival, still engaged in internal party debates, this is vindication. At a closed-door seminar in Delhi, he thunders, "Look around you. The world has spoken. Command economies have failed. Our mistake was not that we were not left enough. It was that we were afraid to embrace the market earlier." Someone in the audience, a younger leader who grew up hearing stories of EMS, asks politely, "And what of Kerala? What of those advances in health and education that even the World Bank now praises?" The old Congress leader pauses, then shrugs. "Kerala is an exception," he says, "not a model. Exceptions cannot feed 1 billion people." News of such remarks inevitably reaches EMS. He does not respond with a speech. He responds with a book. In the early 1990s, in his 80s, he sits down to write one of the most painful works of his life, an assessment of what went wrong in the socialist world, particularly in the Soviet Union, and what that means for Marxists in a post-Soviet age. Page after page, he dissects the bureaucratization, the suppression of internal democracy, the privilege, the arrogance of a party that claimed to act for the working class while sealing itself off from criticism. For a man who spent a lifetime defending that world, it is an act of intellectual self-cruelty. He could have taken an easier path, blaming everything on external enemies, washing his hands of any responsibility, retreating into nostalgia. Instead, he does the most radical thing an old revolutionary can do. He openly names his own illusions. Some comrades wince. They worry the criticism will demoralize younger cadres. They fear it will be seized upon by the right as proof that Marxists are finally confessing their sins. Others, especially a new generation of student activists, find in his honesty a reason to stay, a sign that their movement is not a mausoleum of old certainties but a living, self-correcting tradition. In Kerala, the People's Planning Campaign moves into its most intense phase. The 5-year clock ticks loudly. Reports pile up on EMS's desk, some triumphant, others messy. One panchayat has dramatically improved drinking water access. Another has overspent on a half-finished community hall. A district has mobilized thousands of women into neighborhood groups to manage microcredit. A neighboring block has been captured by a local clique who treat the funds as their personal loot. His health worsens. Doctors tell him to slow down. He smiles, not unkindly, and asks, "Tell me, doctor, if I slow down, will capital also slow down? Will privatization wait for me to finish my notes?" He writes shorter pieces, but more frequently. His columns in the party daily become a kind of running commentary on a changing world. Thoughtful, often severe critiques of liberalization, sympathetic but unsparing analyses of movements that call themselves revolutionary but fall into adventurism. Calm, precise dissections of each new policy the Congress or its successors announce. He almost never raises his voice. That, in itself, becomes a kind of weapon. In the middle of the 1990s, the two old rivals find themselves unexpectedly on the same stage once again, a public discussion on the future of Indian democracy organized by a university. Their bodies have shrunk, their hair is thin and white, but their eyes, when they meet, carry decades of unfinished argument. When the moderator invites them to speak about what they most fear for India's political future, the Congress veteran surprises the hall. "I fear fragmentation," he says. I fear this constant bargaining of small parties, this erosion of national parties, this weakening of the center. Without a strong center, we will fall apart. EMS, invited to respond, does not pounce on the apparent justification for the central control he has always resisted. Instead, he leans into the microphone and says very quietly, "I fear something slightly different. I fear that in the name of stability, we will throttle the very democracy we say we defend, whether through authoritarian laws or through the silent rule of money. I fear a democracy without people, only television and advertisements." The hall is briefly silent. Then, from the back, a student shouts, "And what should we do then?" EMS looks directly toward the voice he cannot quite see. "Organize," he says simply. But not only in parties, in neighborhoods, in workplaces, in women's collectives, in panchayats. Democracy is not saved in parliament alone. It is saved, or lost, where you live. By the late 1990s, his own world has shrunk to a few familiar roots: home, party office, newspaper. His wife, Sushila, fusses gently over his medicines. Grandchildren dart in and out of rooms piled with books in multiple languages. Visitors arrive constantly. Young leaders seeking advice, foreign scholars wanting interviews, villagers hoping he will write a note to some official on their behalf. He refuses most requests for personal favors. "The system should work without my scribble," he grumbles, but spends hours with the young. He tells them stories they do not expect, of doubts he had, of mistakes made, of times when the party was wrong. He warns them that the enemy is not just out there in the shape of rival parties or corporations. It also lurks in here, in laziness, in arrogance, in the temptation to turn slogans into substitutes for work. The last twist in his rivalry comes not in a debate hall but in a hospital corridor. His Congress opponent, now himself ailing, is wheeled in for treatment a few days after EMS has been admitted with complications. For a brief period, the two men who once embodied opposing futures for Kerala lie in the same building, hooked up to similar machines, untended by the same overworked nurses who grew up in a state shaped by their clashes. One evening, as EMS is wheeled for a test, the two trolleys pass each other. It happens quickly. Orderlies are in a hurry. Relatives are distracted. But for a second, two sets of tired eyes meet. There is no grand reconciliation, no exchange of profound last words, just a small nod from each, a recognition. We argued all our lives about the road, but we walked the same landscape, and we both tried, in our own flawed ways, to leave it better than we found it. On March 19, 1998, the clock that had watched EMS through clandestine meetings, assembly debates, prison cells, planning sessions, editorial deadlines finally stops. He dies in Thiruvananthapuram, surrounded by family and comrades. News spreads with the speed of habit. In villages where his name has been uttered in anger and in gratitude for half a century, people pause. Shop shutters lower for a while. Flags, red, tricolor, even the occasional party symbol of his old rival, fly at half-mast. At his funeral procession, under a sky heavy with the threat of rain, the contradictions of his life walk side by side. Women who once carried bricks for construction now walk with university degrees in their bags. Former tenants, owning the land they till, shuffle forward in worn sandals. Nurses from primary health centers, teachers from tiny hill schools, local panchayat members carrying files of projects that trace their ancestry back to his ideas, all press against the bamboo barricades for a last glimpse. There are also those who never forgave him, descendants of landlords who lost estates, managers who fought bitterly against education, reforms, small traders who still curse strikes. Some of them come too out of curiosity, duty, or perhaps a more complicated feeling they cannot name. His body, wrapped in red and the national tricolor, moves slowly through a city that has grown taller and noisier since he first walked its streets as a young agitator. Somewhere along the route, a boy on his father's shoulders asks, "Who is this?" The father thinks for a moment. "He was the man," he says slowly, "who argued with everyone. It is not a bad epitaph." In the years since his death, Kerala's story has not become simple. Governments alternate, coalitions fracture and reform. New challenges erupt. Environmental disasters, questions about migrant labor, debates over religious extremism, anxieties about jobless growth. The global economy pulls at the state, offering chances and threats in equal measure. And yet certain stubborn facts remain. A girl born in a fishing village is still more likely to survive, learn to read, and access basic health care than if she were born in many richer parts of India. Village meetings still argue fiercely about budgets. Land disputes still reference the sealing laws that once seemed so radical. Political parties, for all their sins, still fear the judgment of a population that knows how to read pamphlets and newspapers. Every statistic cited in glossy reports about the Kerala model carries invisibly faint fingerprints from that narrow upstairs room where an old man once raced the sunrise to finish another article. His writings, hundreds of articles, dozens of books in Malayalam and English, continue to be thumbed by students, misquoted by opponents, are reclaimed by new movements. Some ideas age badly. Others, to the surprise even of their author, grow sharper in a world where inequality is once again yawning wider by the day. In the end, perhaps the most radical thing about E.M.S. Namboodiripad is not that he was a communist who became chief minister through the ballot. It is that he refused to treat any position, from underground cadre to head of government to aging columnist, as a place to rest. For him, each role was simply a new vantage point from which to ask the same relentless question, one that still hangs over Kerala, as coconut groves and concrete towers, over India's special economic zones and its slums, over a world lurching between opulence and hunger. How far can democracy be stretched, in time, in space, in courage, before those who profit from inequality decide it has gone too far? He did not live to see the answer. Neither have we. The clock he listened to is still ticking.